we were looking at this work, the end last week, the Red Studio of 1911, I was taking things quite slow because we just started looking at 20th century art, and I thought it would be helpful to take a bit of time looking at Matisse's Fauve period work, since he was the first artist of the 20th century we were considering. And Fauvism, his Fauvism was the first. Fauvism was the first movement we were looking at. We only looked at him as a Fauve. We haven't looked at the other Fauves. I'll speed up maybe a little bit now as we look at the later work of Matisse. So 1911, he produced this interior scene. Actually, that was a year when he produced a number of important interior paintings. Interior scenes are one of the themes that come back again and again in Matisse's work. And that was a particular year of focus on that. Before I show you some other examples, I'll just say a little bit about Matisse's influence on later artists. Very diverse kind of influence. So if we just take this one painting, one could relate it to this abstract expressionist painting by Barnett Newman, Vir Heroicus Sublimus, Man Heroic and Sublime, he titles it in Latin. It's a massive wall-size painting, abstract painting. So if you stand in front of it, it fills your whole field of vision if you're standing close enough. You can come closer, you can go further away, get different experiences of it. But it has, I think it's hard to imagine, although this is an abstract painting and Matisse never made abstract painting, nevertheless it's hard to imagine this kind of painting without Matisse. You know, a painting flooded with red, just this big sort of sail of red with a few lines, vertical lines, punctuating it, activating it, breaking it up or holding it together, depending on how you want to think of it. And one, of course, of those lines is a white line, so it makes us think a little bit of how the Matisse painting, against the saturated red outlines of objects, are in white. Unbounded redness, the same way that Matisse has a kind of unbounded redness. You know, as I mentioned last week, there's no corner to the room. It's a kind of expansive sense of space. He's interested in intimate space, but he doesn't want it to feel too small, too bounded. He wants a sense of largeness at the same time as he's dealing with intimacy. So it's a funny thing that, you know, abstract art, when it had a new resurgence in the post-war period, especially amongst these American abstract expressionists like Barnett Newman. The sources for that new resurgence of abstract art was not primarily abstract art of the first half of the 20th century. The inspirations from it came from artists who themselves were not abstract artists. It's slightly paradoxical. So for Jackson Pollock, Picasso was very important. Surrealism was very important. And for Barnett Newman, I think Matisse was very important. But then here is a very different kind of artist from a slightly later date taking interest in Matisse, and I would say in that same Matisse work. So the Barnett Newman painting is 1950 to 51. The Caulfield painting is 1975, After Lunch. Caulfield is one of the most important British pop artists. You know, pop art has two main expressions, the British expression and the American expression. British pop artists like Caulfield or Hockney, Peter Blake. The Americans, Liechtenstein and Warhol, etc. But here, again, it's an interior scene. Caulfield liked to take his subjects from like interior design magazines and so forth, slightly out of date material, promoting the modern environment. But he's saturated it with blue, just as Matisse saturates his interior with red. And even the introduction of this, goldfishes in a tank, that's a Matisse motif. I haven't shown you any Matisse paintings of goldfish, but yes, they do appear in Matisse's interior scenes or as a subject. This is a painting within a painting reference as well. This is more explicit. This is a scene that we see in a Courbet painting. Like a lot of these pop art is the beginning of postmodernism, if you like, where there's a lot of quotation art, self-consciously about art. So I think we're meant to see the Courbet reference, we're meant to see the Matisse reference, which is localized but also globally present in the painting. So back to Matisse, and still 1911, looking at other examples of his interest in interiors in that year. The Painter's Family. Actually, sorry, this is 1912. But anyway, it's during this same period, 1911, 1912, that he produces a number of interesting interiors. So during this period of his life, and we saw his Fauve period and saw how after that, if Fauvism is, you can date to around 1904, 1905, 1906 maybe. A lot of the works Matisse produced after that time is working out the legacy of Fauvism. So even the subject matter, like the subject of the Ring of Dancers, that's 1910, but it looks back to one of the motif in his Joy of Living painting of this Fauve period. So part of what he's doing at that time is exploring Fauvism, sometimes reducing it down very simple to the minimum possible, even like that same dance painting, only 3 colors. Another thing that he's doing during these years is responding to Cubism, and we'll see examples of that as we go ahead today. And another kind of bifurcation in his art. On the one hand, there's works that seem to really sort of simplify things. Sometimes that's tied to the Cubist influence, and other times there are works which seem to introduce a new richness, and this would be an example of that. So compartmentalized areas of rich decoration, the carpet, he's introducing decorative art objects into the world of his painting because they were there in his studio. He traveled to North Africa, gained these particular interest in Islamic decorative arts, but others also are shown. Decoration, but always sort of bounded, separated off, different decorative areas side by side. The chessboard becomes a sort of decorative motif right at the sort of center of the painting, but everywhere, wallpaper, everything is rich in decoration, although he's introducing some areas of the painting where they're flat areas of color to give our eye relief from those decorations, so activating the surface. One of the effects of all this is to find another way of of counteracting the smallness of an intimate interior space, creating a larger sense of space. Just as he used the saturated red in the first painting we were looking at, the red interior. So the repetitiousness of design creates a sense as if the painting space continues beyond the frame. We imagine the same motifs repeating. So it busts the frame, or it tests the framing edge. The forms within the painting don't just sit politely within the frame and accept the frame. They're sort of in dynamic contestation with it. Everything is more active, or the sense of space becomes larger, but without going back to a pre-modern, a sort of Renaissance approach of creating an illusion of perspective or deep space. Space comes in a different way. So all this is something, I mean, and then he picks up the black and white of the chessboard in the black and white of her dress, for instance. So colour, you can talk about colour composition in that way. But a big influence on him in all this is Islamic art, which I've already mentioned. And one key moment was in 1910 when he saw in Munich a major exhibition of Islamic art. Artists are often inspired by particular exhibitions that bring a new focus on a certain area. When I was in England, I did some art school teaching, and the students would always pick up on some artist that has an exhibition. There's a Beckmann exhibition, and suddenly all the students are doing kind of Beckmann style paintings, that sort of thing. It's very common. So certain things come in the air, and that's a useful thing to do as an art historian, to try and check what was popular or newly rediscovered at the time an artist did something. So this compartmentalized space is something you see in Islamic art too. I'm just showing you a Persian miniature, just a random example, but you see the same sort of thing. The bright colors but compartmentalize, some pure colors, as in that Matisse interior too. There is space. We understand space, but there's no perspective. Higher up the painting equals further away. It's a convention that works. Some of these paintings are relatively small. They're made to go in on the printed page, but nevertheless, they have a sense of greater space in them. So just a couple of examples. Here's what Matisse himself said. He says, "Persian miniatures," this is an example, "revealed to me all the possibilities of my senses. Because of its dense detail, this art suggests a larger space, a truly plastic space, and it helped me to go beyond intimate painting." So he's saying exactly what I've said. It creates a larger sense of space. So this is all, the vision in crisis theme. The artist discovering other cultures and other ways of looking that go along with other cultures. The Islamic world is a very large place. It's only a very shorthand idea to talk about Islamic art. Actually, it's a variety of different arts from different cultures. Turkish art is maybe very different from Moroccan art, etc., etc. Persian art is very different from the art of Arab countries, perhaps, and so on. So in addition to seeing something like a Persian miniature, he will also have contact with North African art. Some North African countries were French colonies at that time, and it's not so hard to travel over the Mediterranean from the southern coast of France to visit them, and Matisse did so. So he has some contact, direct personal contact with Islamic culture in that way. Visual culture. So one more example of a Matisse interior scene from this time, 1911 to 12. Well, this is 1911. Interior with eggplants or aubergines. You see them here, 3 of them. This, if anything, is more deeply saturated with decoration, very alive and active visually. It's not so much decoration for decoration's sake. It's decoration turned into a kind of formal motif. It's more to create a visual active. We're more aware of the individual forms because we're looking at a painting than we would be if we were looking at just some background decorative hanging or wallpaper in a room. It's almost like a sort of stamp that he stamped the same form across. It helps unify the space of the canvas. But again, compartmentalization is important. The decoration expands and denies the limits of the framing space, but at the same time it's compartmentalized. You see decoration on screens, for example, a mirror that complicates the space of the painting, so some of the objects in the painting are sort of doubled and expanded, so playing between 2D and 3D. This is a black and white photo that was taken that shows a kind of frame, painted frame, expanding the decoration even further. Well, this shows the painting hanging in Matisse's studio. So some contemporary documentary photos. Photos can be a helpful source for us in 20th century study. It's something you don't have, obviously, for earlier periods of art history. Now a figure painting. Portrait of Madame Matisse, 1913. Much more subdued colour than the ones we've been looking at. So one really notices the difference between that very rich decoration of those works and the very pared down feeling of this. You do see a sort of disparity, a difference within his output in these years. And I think really this is one of the works in which he's responding to what Picasso and Braque are doing to Cubism. He himself never becomes a Cubist as such, but he is in dialogue with it. Dialogue from a little bit of a distance. He's aware that Picasso is a major artist, and Picasso is certainly aware that Matisse is a major artist. They have an important dialogue going on, artistic dialogue going on. The most obviously striking thing here is the face, which is really mask-like in its simplification. We've met that kind of thing before. We've met it in some Cézanne portraits, and indeed Cézanne is one of the influences here, but more immediately is the influence of African art. It's important for Matisse. It's also important for the Cubists, but particularly Picasso, more than Braque. And in this particular case, we can say it's an individual example of African art that is important. One particular mask, which I'm showing you here, which was in the collection of Derain, the good friend of Matisse and of also known to Picasso. The way the nose is treated, joined to the eyebrows, and the eyes sort of seem to be out of proportion, but all that is very close to what we're seeing in Matisse's painting. It's all very simplified, but nevertheless it was painted from life. It might not seem that way, but he worked from the model. The model is his wife, painting her in the garden of the home he was living in at that time. Over 100 sittings. She sat for over 100 times for a painting which is so reductive, which at the end of it seems to leave very little of her personality there. But it took, that's Matisse's way of working. He always has to start from reality and pare it down. That for the end result to be authentic, the process has to be authentic, to start from reality. He can't suddenly jump. He can't just sort of look at a an African mask and jump to produce something like this, because that would be, it's not achieved in the right way, or it doesn't have a kind of truth to it. So there's a sort of abstracting process going on in his work. We saw that a little bit last time, where I showed you one or two works where there was more than one version, like the Young Sailor 1 and 2. The second one is more synthetic, more simplified. So simplicity of form, approaching reality through feeling. It's about the idea of the primitive as more authentic. There are some. That's the same idea that was there with Fauvism itself, that we've got to renew art by going back to the basics, and maybe cultures that seem more elemental, more simple in certain ways, can give us some hints. They haven't yet lost touch with feeling, with nature, in the way that our modern civilizations, in their perhaps over-sophisticated ways, may have done. Matisse has a story that he tells retrospectively about discovering an African mask. He says, "I often visited Gertrude Stein, the American writer and collector, who was the friend of Matisse and Picasso and collector of their work. I often visited Gertrude Stein in the Rue de Fleurs. On the way was a little antique shop. One day I noticed in its window a small Negro head carved in wood, which reminded me of the huge heads in the Egyptian gallery of the Louvre. I bought the head for a few francs and took it along to Gertrude Stein's. There I found Picasso, who was astonished by it. We discussed it at length, and that was the beginning of the interest we all have taken in Negro art. And we have shown it to greater or lesser degrees in our pictures." So that's his acknowledgement of his interest in this kind of art. He wasn't talking about this specific mask, by the way, but I think one has to be a little wary of these sort of stories as an art historian. It's all a bit too neat to kind of have a nice story that tells you the day it all started. There are other stories of how Picasso got to see African art. For instance, there's a story that Derain dragged him to the Museum of Mankind in Paris, the Musée de l'Homme, the Trocadero Museum, to see African art. Derain seems to have been interested in it before Picasso was. Clearly, African sculpture often has this simplicity to it. There's willingness to break away from realism, and that's an inspiration. But as I already said, Picasso and Matisse both were interested in Cézanne. So Cézanne, we know he's already aware of Cézanne's work right from the late 19th century, the early years of his own production. So the slightly mask-like faces, the way Cézanne treated his own wife in portraits. So again, it's this vision in crisis, looking to other cultures that is important, but there's something from his own cultural tradition that is helpful as well. Bathers by the River, 1916 to 17. This is also a work where I feel he is responding to Picasso and to Cubism, but as I say, from a certain distance. It's not actually, I think, a painting you could call Cubist. But again, the colour scheme is fairly reductive. The rich and decorative qualities we see in other works are absent here. A lot of black and white. The main colour is just some green for the foliage. The black here represents a river. One figure is stepping into the river. That's why you can't see the feet. Formally, it's very simple. These sort of vertical strips, break the painting space up into these distinct vertical strips, and then having done that, and the vertical forms of the figures sort of align with that, sometimes almost directly, though some limbs escape the boundary. Not quite here. Here, definitely, this is a figure that links two of these strips. This sort of treatment is a little bit, about the closest one can get to, say, a kind of cubist fragmentation of forms, almost sort of transparency, translucency, interpenetration of forms. Same here, the features start to be lost. But looking at it as a kind of compositional task, first he's broken everything down into these vertical sections. Then, of course, he has to find ways to bring the composition back together as a whole in some way, to unify it as one image. You know, like shuffling a deck of cards and then playing a game of patience where you start to order them back out into the four suits you read. In order to make the game possible, you have to break from the order of the cards to begin with. So, a figure linking, that's one way, or finding, rhyming certain forms, that ovals and circles of heads and breasts that sort of rhyme a little bit across the body, help to create visual links, or the very stylized forms of the foliage, by reducing it so much, getting rid of all the detail of all the veinings or the fall of light on the leaves, produces forms which count in their own right in the painting and rhyme with other forms, like these forms here, or this form here, which I suppose we take as a snake. It's like a snake-like form. So all this helps to create order within the image as a whole. So schematization, simplification helps to create a formal language that we can appreciate in its own right. Less can be more. This is a photo taken in black and white of the painting while it's in process, to show how often with Matisse the process can be quite a long one and the painting can change quite a lot. He hasn't planned everything out in drawings in fine detail, and then just the final making of the painting is sort of an unproblematic transcribing of the idea that's already fixed. Often a good creative process will be like that. When you're writing your essays, you'll probably find while you're writing you're having new ideas. The things will move forward while your writing helps you think. You probably won't be able to completely structure your essay in advance and then just write it out word for word. That would be boring. Probably the writing would be boring if you're not having ideas while you're writing. Certainly for Matisse, well, of course there are different ways of working. I'm not trying to tell you how to write an essay. There are many ways. You've got to discover what works with you. But for Matisse, he's pushing the paint around on the canvas. Of course, that's something you could do with oil paint. You couldn't do that with Chinese ink. It would look terrible if you tried to change the painting over and over again. Different mediums allow different ways of working. So, he finds it there's a visual feedback loop. He has to see how it looks to know whether it's working, and then push things around. Just to go back to the theme at the very beginning about Matisse's influence, here's a work by another American abstract expressionist, Robert Motherwell. Probably of the American abstract expressionists, the one who was most interested in European modernism. He could speak French, not all of them could, so he had a particular interest in French art. The Voyage by Robert Motherwell, fairly early abstract work by him, 1949. And I think it's hard to imagine a work like this without the Matisse bathers, the vertical stripes, the interest in black and white, even the oval shapes. The Matisse painting is in Chicago. He could have seen it easily. Matisse's son had an art gallery in New York anyway, and that's another connection to New York. Yeah, so. And this is the more sort of signature style of Robert Motherwell. One of the works from his Elegies to the Spanish Republic series. His most well-known works like this are more gestural. There's some interest in Chinese and Japanese brush painting. That's another source that's coming in. But for our purposes today, I'm just sort of emphasizing there's still something of that one Matisse painting. I think the vertical strip forms in black and white, and then these oval shapes. If you like, male and female kind of yin and yang type imagery. Anyway, if you just look at something like this, it would be hard to think of Matisse, but actually there is a kind of lineage there that traces it back to a work like this. Back to Matisse. So the Moroccans. So a little bit in its subject matter, this is 1916, a little bit in its subject matter of a reminder of Matisse's interest in the Islamic world. Morocco, a North African country just across the Mediterranean from France. Again, very simplified, some sort of cubist-like simplification, schematization, breaking down of forms. They become very hard to read, but I think what we're seeing here is a group of figures sitting on a rug or a mat of some kind. Maybe they're drinking coffee or something like that, I think. One figure with his back to us, sort of turbaned or, anyway, covered head, wearing these sort of long robes. The other figure's a little harder to make out. It's a very common sight. If you go to an Arab country today, you can. They tend to be quite hot countries. You might see a group of men sitting out on a rug in the evening in some public area, just chatting amongst their friends. It's a normal kind of sight to see. So that's one motif. Then here is the roof of a building, a balcony of a building, whitewashed house, a plant pot on the balcony. And here seems to be a rack maybe with some melons out for sale or drying or something like that. Although with the leaves, although the forms also look a little bit like Muslim figures in prayer. There's a kind of like a double reference, a sort of visual punning, which becomes possible through the very simplification of the visual language, by instead of a literal-minded realism, by using this stylized treatment of forms, then that kind of a new richness is possible, the richness of a pun. And the simplification also allows visual rhyming across different parts of the painting. The painting has been broken. The space has been broken basically into three areas: the right-hand area, the top part, the bottom part, and then he finds ways to link the areas together. Visual rhyming distorting things. Poets do that sometimes. They distort the sound of a word to make it fit a rhyme or rhythm. Why can't an artist do the same thing? A novelist will leave out a lot of detail of what, the novel would never get finished if the novelist had to tell you what the light was like falling on the wall of the room where the two lovers were, or whatever it was. You can't. You never get to the end of the novel. You have to say Anne, and her eyes were blue with little specks of. You never get there if you had to deal with realism. What color was the floor covering, or everything? What design was on the murderer's tie, or you haven't got time for all that detail. So why can't a painter also move away from realism? One very simplifying thing here is the use of black. It eliminates a lot of detail. Black is the ground, but black also is the roof. So two things very different in space become unified. Black, of course, we associate with shadow, but here black seems to be representing light. I mean, that's common in Matisse, to think of black as a color, not to think of it as just an absence of color. Here is Matisse talking about black, and he ends up talking, I think, about this painting, although the statement is from 1946, much later. He talks about black as the color of light. He says, before, when I didn't know what color to put down, I put down black. Black is a force. I depend on black to simplify the construction. Doesn't my painting of the Moroccans use a grand black, which is as luminous as the other colors in the painting? He'd spent the winter of 1912 to 13 in Tangier in North Africa, so it's some memories of that maybe coming back here. If you're painting, pink is a little bit of a difficult color to deal with sometimes, how to use that. But by putting the pink over black, I think he's found a way to deal with it. That kind of makes something interesting happen. This is what North Africa was like at the time. Not that exotic looking, right? I mean, it's just because they are French colonies, and it's so everything is written in French, and there are a lot of foreigners around, and there's no pure space of otherness left. But in Matisse's painting, you do get that, just as in Gauguin, you get a sense of as if the other is still there in its more pure form. This is his son Paul playing the piano. The piano lesson, 1916. Yeah, very geometricized, or simplified forms. Even his face is broken. So still cubism is in his mind. These are triangle shapes there in the metronome on the piano, and the bit of light-filled grass in the garden. Real human figures, but also figures in paintings, reality and images. Well, it's all an image, but playing with different layers of reality. A sculpture, a painting. I think that's all I'll say about that. But I wanted to introduce it partly because then I could introduce a drawing of the same subject. It's not just a drawing that is purely a study for the painting. It kind of stands up in its own right, I think, as a drawing. So very, very linear. There's no areas of tone. But he's not really concerned with outline. He's more concerned with activating rhythmic forms. They don't quite work as outlines, but well, we know enough about the vase, say, or in the 1920s, there's a sort of retrenchment in Matisse's work. It's back to a more realistic style. There's more sense of modelling coming in the way that the torso of this figure is treated, for instance. And this is a general tendency, and we'll see it in Picasso's work too of that time, a willingness to go back to a kind of idiom that he would never have used a few years earlier. Around this time, Matisse is moving to the south of France. He's not living in Paris. He's not trying to be an artist at the cutting edge of things anymore. By the 1920s, you have surrealism and all sorts of things happening. His reputation is established. He doesn't feel he needs to sort of compete for being different in that way. Partly, this is a dialogue with the art of the past. 19th century artists like Ingres. I had reason to mention Ingres when we were talking about some of his earlier work. So maybe Ingres is in his mind, who also painted this theme of the odalisque, the harem slave. So again, we're in a kind of exoticizing North African Orientalist fantasy world, but in Matisse's case, it's all brought a bit more down to earth. The model doesn't really seem to be from that part of the world. It's just a French model dressed up in some exotic clothing. It's all sort of laid bare for what it is. There's no pretending, and there's no narrative element as there is with no kind of mise en scene. There is all this rich decoration, but we're aware that it's just sort of props that are placed there. He's carefully, obviously, arranged the decoration for what will suit his colour composition. So the odalisque theme is something he deals with a little bit at this time. That's related, but rather a certain kind of stiffness in the figure. Maybe that's a deliberate contrast with the richness of the decoration. To talk about the dance mural that he produced for the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, in Merion in Philadelphia. It was for a rather unusual space. It's this, hence, the strange shape. It had to go up near the roof, in the arches. Hence this unusual shape, difficult shape to work with because it's very narrow at certain points. So the difficulty of the physical shape is one thing. Then below it are a series of windows. That creates two problems. One is a lot of light is coming in, and the other is there's nature to be seen through the window, trees and so forth. And nature is a very difficult thing even for art to compete with. Nature is perfect already, right? It's wonderful. Art would have to aspire to be that good. And then below those windows are masterpieces in the collection itself, because it's an art gallery space by post-impressionists and early modern artists. Matisse's Joy of Living was in this collection. It used to be on a sort of staircase building. The whole collection has moved to a new museum building now in the center of the city of Philadelphia. I haven't seen it in its new site. Anyway, there was a problem with measuring the space, so he produced the work, but then found out the measurements were wrong, so he had to kind of redo it. It was a commission work. and here is the second version. Sorry, it's only a black and white image I have for you. This is the version actually installed, slightly different measurements, but rather than just slightly changing the original composition to save himself time, he actually rethought the whole thing from the beginning. And it ends up quite different. It's almost like wrestlers or something, you know, rather than as much as dancers. They both have these sort of striped, coloured forms in the background. Then the figures themselves become very simplified. Just white with a few lines to indicate features, activate the form to give you a sense of the movement. It's a little bit hard to make out, but there's also a sort of penumbra around the figures that makes them stand out a little bit in front of the background. I think you can sort of see it here. It produces a sense, sort of layered sense in space, but obviously the figures are very much balanced against the background. The forms, you know, this figure, for instance, moving in this direction, and the form in the background has the blue form is moving in that direction, but against a differently coloured form moving in the opposite direction. So it's all activating straight lines against the curved edge of the space, or the curved forms of the figures. But it was very important for Matisse to work. This is a large scale work, and it was important for him to work on the same scale as the actual work itself. So he had he developed this method of having his drawing tool at the end of a long stick, you know, so you can make big scale marks. Not just making small scale drawings and then blowing them up, which a lot of people might do, because he felt the gesture has to be appropriate to the scale for it to really work aesthetically. He talks about leaving out the features because he feels in an architectural setting, that the artwork has to be part of the architecture as an ensemble, as a whole. So you don't want to be too much human interest, which features would produce, would distract from that sense of the environment as a whole. And also the flatness as well helps to fit that kind of architectural setting. It's very different from earlier mural painting of the Baroque era, say, where a lot of that is illusionistic. It breaks the surface of the wall, creates an illusory space, but that's very different from what Matisse has done here. Pink Nude, 1935. Very simple, slightly modulated pink form of the body against curved forms contrasted with geometric forms in the background, grid-like structures. Patterned areas contrasted with plain areas, very simple elements. One reason I'm showing you this particular one is that we happen to have a lot of photos that document his working process, so that's really interesting. Let's look at them. Well, I'm not showing all of them, but anyway, some of them. So as it starts off much more realistic, one could imagine, say, that portrait of his wife with a mask-like face, it would have started off much more realistic as well. We can see what this is behind. It's a chair with an elaborate back to it, and there's a vase of flowers on it, that may not be altogether clear from the final work and what we're looking at here. But yeah, that's what it is. So starting to shift the pose. Something he did with the Marion dancers, the Philadelphia dancers, which he seems to be doing here, is to use strips of coloured paper to test out colours. That seems to be what he's doing here. And later that becomes a kind of medium in its own right. Sort of as he works on it, he starts to distort the anatomy. It's not a woman, it's a painting, you know, so it has to follow the rules of a painting. It has to work as a painting. Art and reality are not the same thing. Exactitude is not truth. That's something Delacroix said, but Matisse seems to pick up that idea too. Yeah, so just give you some sense of it. She has to go, the pose has to go through a journey, even sort of going back to in some senses from trying some things out and then move back. It's okay to experiment, you know, same if you're writing an essay, you know, you can try things, see if it works, try it. If it doesn't, okay, no problem, you know, go back. Save your previous drafts, you know, always. That's something Matisse couldn't do. Yeah, you can do that with an etching. You can print one state of the etching and then rework it. And you have the previous state and the new state. I'm pushing to finish our discussion of Matisse, so I'm delaying your break. Sorry about that, but I think it makes more sense to do so. This is the Lady in Blue, 1937. Oh, this is a period of the Spanish Civil War. You know, we're just 2 years, 1936, 1937. We're just 2 years away from the outbreak of the Second World War. There's a lot of kind of tension in Europe. But in the world of Matisse's painting, we don't see anything like that. You know, it's still a world of harmony. If you like, you could treat that as a critique of him. You know, this is the year of Picasso's Guernica, you know, a great cry against warfare. Although admittedly that's pretty unusual in his output as well. But Matisse doesn't have a Guernica moment. Again, we have the sort of flat areas of colour against decorated areas, but although the decoration is fairly geometric and simple in its own terms compared to the very rich decoration we've seen in some earlier works. Reducing things to 3 primary colours, black and white, plus a little bit of green at the top here, just to activate. Almost symmetrical, the image. Well, just a few things like the pose of the hand which break with symmetry, activate it visually. Painting, it's a sort of mixture between painting and drawing. A lot of the lines have a kind of drawn feel to them, very lovely kind of sinuous line. Picking up the black and white in the colour of her necklace she holds in her hand. Very frontal view, fitting the flatness of the image. Large red interior, 1948. Reminds us of the one we started off today with, the red interior from 1911, the Red Studio from 1911, which itself kind of recalls the 1908 Harmony in Red, the predominant red in interior scene. Although here the red is very roughly brushed, so we see a sort of white showing through, especially in certain areas. Again, this one is fairly symmetrical. There are two paintings on the wall, there are two tables, there are two animals. Because it's so stylized, it's very ambiguous. Are these animal skin rugs on the floor, or is it just a couple of cats or dogs, with I don't even know which, running around in the interior? Are these actually paintings? Could one of them be a window or a mirror reflecting something in the room? There's a little bit of ambiguity about it all. There's enough space to read it as a three-dimensional image without worrying all about the details of perspective. Artists are discovering perspective is an optional extra, or it's just one thing you could use if you wanted to. And maybe space was the last thing created. Maybe he just adds on a line for the corner of the room fairly late on in the process of making the painting. It's not like an earlier artist who attempted to create a spatial box first, and then you sort of populate it and decorate it and all that sort of thing. But space can be alluded to in other ways. At the very end of his life, because of fading health, it's hard for him even to sort of hold the brush, but he's carrying on with his creative work, and so we see him using a creative solution to that, what would otherwise be a sort of dead end for his practice, turning to coloured paper, cut to the shapes that he wants it. So it starts with this book illustrations, really. This is a prominent early example is the jazz portfolio from 1947. This is the circus scene, introducing words into the image. That's a sort of thing that comes from Cubism and Cubist collage. And you could say this whole technique is a kind of collage technique, but whereas Picasso and Braque use collaged papers that have some flavour of the real world in them, a piece of newspaper or something, Matisse is just using bits of paper that he or his assistants have coloured with different colours. And collage has an advantage: you can rework, you can try one thing. If it doesn't work, you can completely rechange the composition until the moment where you glue things down. Unlike the paintings like the Pink Nude, where that's a lot of effort to repaint on the same canvas. But this you could move around very quickly. Yeah, so here he is. He's in a wheelchair, cutting out different shapes. The Blue Nude. Well, Blue Nude 2, 1952. In this case, just one colour. Very simple. It's quite a large image, about this size, I think. So the white, ties form and background together. The white represents the background, but it also delineates the form. The white here is a bracelet. The white here presumably represents shadow, darkness. It does all these different jobs simultaneously, and there's no problem with that. We don't find that confusing. We don't have to be told every little detail in order to engage visually. We're not babies. We can be active as spectators. 1953, it's the closest perhaps that Matisse comes to abstraction, the snail, 1953. We're into the second half of the century now, but just at the very end of Matisse's life. It's a large painting. It's in the Tate Gallery in London. So working with paper, colour, almost as if he's can work directly with colour in these late works. It had to start from a drawing, and it had to start from an engagement with reality. That's why it's not really an abstract work of art. His inspiration is always the real world. So this snail, all we may be left with is something of a spiral, which reminds us of the snail's shell. That's about all that's left, but the starting point had to be reality. He says, first of all, I drew the snail from nature, holding it between my two fingers, drew and redrew. I became aware of an unfolding. I formed in my mind a purified sign for a shell. Then I took the scissors. It was important that the end should always be contained in the beginning. Further, I had to establish the connection between the object observed and its observer. There's a kind of dialogue going on that has to be, the integrity of which has to be preserved. So the white is a kind of background, but it also, you could read the white forms as positive shapes, which the colours sort of qualify. Background is, it would be a failure if the background was just red as background. Putting complementary colours side by side, the blue and the orange. The orange is all over it. It kind of creates a sort of frame within the frame. Blue's a fairly heavy colour. It seems sort of appropriate that it should be down the bottom. But black's heavy too, and yet it's managed to sort of push its way up to the top of everything. The orange frames everything, but other forms seem to intrude into the orange. They're not letting the orange master them completely. Little bits of overlap, but a lot of the time you're not getting overlap. So when everything is so simple, it's almost so abstracted, then little incidents count visually. The slight overlap of one form to another becomes a major incident within the painting, whereas in a realist painting, that the formal play would not read at all. You'd just be interested in the pretty girl's blonde hair or whatever it is. You wouldn't look at the painting as a formal arrangement that could be pleasing in its own right. And finally, the swimming pool. It's a plan for a decoration of a swimming pool. So supposedly something utilitarian, you could say, although never actualized. It's so big I can't get it into one slide, so it's like on two walls. I wrote a book called Water and Art, and I want to include this one in my book, but the Matisse family, who own the rights to it, they said, no, you can only reproduce it if you reproduce the whole of it, you know, and a book that wide, it would be such a tiny little thing, because it's actually, let me just get the exact, it's 54 feet long, so it used to be a little tiny thing, and you couldn't even photograph it in one photograph. So what you'd have to do, you'd have to buy about 10 photos. They sell each one individually, priced individually, and you'd have to put them together. Or they suggested, well, you could have one of those images that unfolds. You know, yeah. Well, if your publisher is very rich, you might be able to. And then they said, oh, we've got another one you can have, and we'll even give you the slide for free, the image for free. And that's a ceramic version. But the problem with the ceramic version is that Matisse didn't make a ceramic version. The Matisse estate had made a ceramic version after his death. So they want someone to try and publish it in an art historical book, and then it becomes more acceptable. So this is just a little example of the difficulty. If any of you become an art historian, you have to deal with the rights holders, and it's a difficult situation. So in the end, I couldn't include the image at all because no details were possible. Well, what do we see? We see human figures diving into the water. We see marine creatures in the water. We see a sort of, the water itself, splashes of the water as people frolic in it. But the white is also the water, presumably. A starfish. The figures are blue against the white of the water, but hey, well, no, this figure is in white. You know, so somehow the figures and their environment become unified. It's a wonderful sort of metaphor of the unity of people with nature or creatures with nature. Swimming, when you're swimming, you're kind of weightless in a way. Your water buoys up your body, so you don't have to worry. You don't have this sense of gravity, fighting against gravity. So yeah, the white is the water. No, it isn't. The blue is the water, and then this strip is the water. No, but anyway, something comes out. You know, it's all. You create a rule, and then you break the rule a little bit. You know, the rule is everything stays within the strip. Well, except when the rule is broken. You know, that you need to break your own rules to make something interesting. But if there's no rules to begin with, it would just be a kind of chaos. And it becomes interesting visually, formally, when a form breaks the line of the white. Or even the white can also break the rule. Oh, you're breaking the rule. I'm going to break the rule as well. You know, I want to. I can move around you if you think you can move around me. When he was in Tahiti on holiday, he had a lovely experience of swimming there in the lagoon, and maybe this is a distant memory of that. All this physical agility. Remember, this is created by a man in a wheelchair. Basically, it's not something he's personally experiencing at that point in time. But it's a wonderful image of human, almost dance-like a movement associated with a physical activity. He used to like to swim, also to row a boat, I think, when he was young, living in the south of France by the sea. So it's a visual pleasure, but I suppose I'm also saying there's something more than that. It's a metaphor of harmony, oneness of the universe, or something like that. That one could say the subject matter here is. The form of the figure, the pose of the diving figure is such that it almost creates an enclosure of the background colour. Background almost becomes a form, not quite close, but almost. A little bit of white is caught as well. It's almost a figure shape, you could say. Well, negative and positive, like yin and yang dancing in harmony. Okay, I think that's enough. So I've kept you rather late, but I think it made sense to go to talk about the end of see Matisse's work through in its entirety. So we have a very late break now. That's the advantage of a double lecture period, that we can do these sort of things if we want to, and then we'll come back to start looking at Picasso.